Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Today I'll be reading American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. This is Chapter 23, The New Deal. When Roosevelt was inaugurated president on March 4, 1933, the American capitalist system, once world boasted as crisis-proof, was in a chaotic, panicky situation. It was experiencing the world economic breakdown worse than any other country. Every bank in the country was closed, industry was paralyzed, domestic and foreign trade had fallen by 50%, about 17 million workers walked the streets unemployed. Hundreds of thousands of farmers had lost their farms, millions of small bank depositors had been robbed of their funds, vast numbers of the middle class had had the mortgages on their homes foreclosed. The disillusioned and discontented masses were stirring aggressively. The whole country was full of militant hunger demonstrations of unemployed, bonus marches of war veterans, farmer strikes, etc. And on all sides the masses talked angrily, if confusedly, about taking drastic action if measures were not adopted at once to relieve them of the intolerable starvation and pauperization that had engulfed them. This threatening situation threw into the ranks of the American capitalist class the greatest fright it has ever known. Their writers and other spokesmen loaded the press and the air with pessimism, fear, and lugubrious forecasts. Finance capital, the great bankers and industrialists, realized that if they were to hang on to their rich rulership of society, something must be done to prop up the collapsing capitalist system and to allay the swiftly mounting mass radicalization. Manifestly, the crude and brutal Hoover policy of simply pouring billions of relief into the coffers of the banks, railroads, etc., and letting everybody else go broke and starve, was heading capitalism straight to disaster. New measures must be taken, and that swiftly. The something that finance capital decided upon to save their capitalist system was contained in Roosevelt's New Deal. The sum-up of the New Deal, as expressed by its score of alphabetical laws and bureaus, was a greatly increased centralization of the federal government and its intensified intervention in economic life along the following main lines. A. Pouring of government billions into the banks, railroads, etc., to save them from threatening bankruptcy. B. Raising the price level through inflation, devaluation of the dollar, immense bond issues, etc., code price fixing, and organized restriction of agricultural and industrial production. C. Liquefying of billions of dollars of the banks that were frozen in unpayable mortgages on farms and homes by extension of payment periods on these mortgages. D. Priming the industrial pump and easing the workers' unrest by large government capital investments in public works. E. Tinkering up by law the worst breaks in the capitalist banking and credit systems, including supervision of the stock exchange, sale of foreign bonds, etc. F. Intensified struggle for world markets, bigger navy, air fleet, army, new tariff agreements, etc. G. Throwing a bone to the starving masses of unemployed and aged by allotting them a niggardly federal relief and skeleton pensions. H. Granting of rights of the workers to organize into labor unions. I. Organized subsidies to farmers for reducing production. By its heavy government spending and minor sops to the masses, the New Deal, in substance, was a shot in the arm, a doping of the economic system out of its deepening crisis. It was calculated to preserve the capitalist system by relieving somewhat the economic and mass pressure. The center of it, the National Recovery Act, NRA, was contrived in Wall Street and was first enunciated by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Many capitalist theoreticians hailed it as the beginning of fascism. To call the New Deal socialistic or communistic is nonsense. It had nothing in common with either. The upheaval of the working masses. It is the proud and not altogether unwarranted boast of the New Dealers that they have saved the capitalist system, at least temporarily. At the time I write these lines, July 1936, The same finance capitalists who heartily supported the New Deal at its outset are now fiercely attacking it, and their Supreme Court is busy knocking out its NRAAs, AAAs, etc., one after the other. But if these capitalists take such a hostile attitude now toward the New Deal, it is only because they believe they are over the worst of the crisis, that the New Deal has exhausted its benefits for them, and that fresh policies of a more reactionary character are necessary. They want to take away even Roosevelt's few concessions to the impoverished masses of workers, farmers, and lower middle class. The workers believed the promises of Roosevelt and, as Jack Stachel said, took seriously the statement that they had the right to join unions of their choice. So, after the beginning of the New Deal and continuing all through 1933, 1934, and to a lesser extent 1935, they developed a great surging mass organization and strike movement, one of the most tempestuous in the history of the American working class. It was a huge spontaneous outburst, an explosion of proletarian wrath against the rapidly rising cost of living, long years of low wages, unemployment, inhuman speed-up, and autocracy in industry. It also revealed a growing lack of faith in the capitalist system as a whole. The big strikes of 1919 to 22 were defensive actions of organized workers under employer attacks, but the 1933 to 35 upheaval was basically a militant and powerful counteroffensive of the unorganized masses. One of the most striking features of the whole movement was the solidarity of the unemployed with the strikers and their refusal to be strikebreakers. With surprise and dismay, the capitalists, who for a dozen years past had been complimenting themselves on the decline of working-class militancy, watched the great toiling masses bestir themselves and launch this historic strike movement. They developed a great distaste for this whole phase of the Roosevelt New Deal. When the NRA was instituted on June 13, 1933, there was already a gradually mounting strike wave underway. The first effect of the NRA was to halt this for a while, and to turn the budding strike movement into a general campaign of union building, the workers relying upon the promises of the government and AFL officials to secure redress of their grievances. But the movement soon passed out of this stage of naive hopefulness. The employers were establishing starvation minimum codes, militantly resisting the spread of the unions, building company unions on all sides, while the government and AFL policy was only one of rosy assurances to the workers. Sensing the situation correctly and realizing that they must fight, the masses burst into a broad strike movement in the last half of 1933 to help Roosevelt enforce the NRA against the employers, as was said widely by the workers at the time. Strikes raged in coal, steel, copper, automobile, textile, needle, and many other industries. The incomplete U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics show there was a total of 812,000 strikers in 1933, as against 242,826 in 1932. With the turn of 1934, the strike movement took on greater volume, the number of strikers for that year amounting to 1,353,608. But more important, the multiplying strikes were of a far greater militancy and a deeper political significance. This was because early in the course of the New Deal, finance capital had made it clear that it was continuing its traditional opposition to the unionization of the open shop basic industries, and the government also soon showed that it would not insist upon such unionization despite its apparent sympathy towards trade unionism. That is why the several conciliation boards set up by the government in industries where the workers were developing strike movements invariably demoralized the new labor unions by yielding to the company unions. The estimates of the growth of company unionism under the New Deal range from 1 million to 3 million. As the New Deal codes developed, it became more and more clear, therefore, that the government's policy, especially in the unorganized basic industries, despite its liberal phrases, led to company unionism, starvation wages, and long hours. Without fully realizing the implications of this situation, large masses of workers nevertheless began to sense the elementary truth that if they were to secure the right of organization and relief for their grievances under the New Deal, they would have to do as the TUUL was urging, write their own codes on the picket lines. Hence, the big strikes of 1934 bore increasingly the character of struggles against the NRA, against its $12 to $15 minimum wage scales, for the right to organize, and against company unionism, against the ruinous delays, fake elections, and equivocations of the various NRA bodies set up by the Roosevelt government with the help of the AFL leadership. The strikes of 1934 to 1936 took on the most acute political character of any in the history of the United States. Against the violent opposition of the AFL leaders, the political mass strike, long a cardinal point in the Communist Party's agitation, became an established weapon of the American working class. The workers fought with splendid heroism and solidarity in the face of the government, tricky union leaders, and an unprecedented use of troops, police, gunmen, and vigilantes against them. The great battles of Toledo, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Terre Haute, 1935, Pekin, 1936, the huge national 1934 textile strike, the national coal strike of 1935, and many other struggles of the period constitute one of the brightest pages in our labor history. The TUUL in the 1933 strikes. The TUUL did not confine itself to issuing manifestos calling upon the workers to strike. On the contrary, from the outset in 1933, it launched all its unions and leagues and minority groups into the surging battle. Its program of struggle found response among the militant, discontented masses. Thus, despite its relative weakness, the TUUL was able to play a very considerable role in stimulating the big struggles and in directing the fighting masses along the path to victory. Through this eventful period, the TUUL was capably led by Jack Stachel, who had been elected Assistant Secretary in December 1931. During the 1932 election campaign, as the presidential candidate of the Communist Party, I suffered a severe heart attack in the midst of a 5-month speaking tour, and I collapsed in Moline, Illinois, on September 8th. For many years I had overworked myself. Besides carrying on much strike and other intense activities, I had made a dozen national speaking tours of 100 to 150 meetings each, several of them on the hobo, in addition to making innumerable shorter tours. These trips had taken me repeatedly into every state and important city in the country, but in the 1932 campaign the pitcher went once too often to the well. Result, a smash-up, angina pectoris, followed by a complete nervous collapse that kept me in bed for 5 months and made my life a literal torture, day and night, for over 2 years. It is only now that I am recovered enough to begin slowly to work again. My best work has always been as a mass organizer during big strikes and other struggles, but it was my doubly bad fate to be laid up helpless all through the bitterly fought mass strikes under the New Deal. TUUL Achievements and Shortcomings. During the 6 years of their existence, the TUUL unions developed a substantial resistance to the wage-cutting, starvation offensive of the employers. In the early and difficult Hoover years of the crisis, while the AFL was submitting unrestingly to the workers' wages being slashed and was allowing the unemployed to be forced down into utter pauperism, the TUUL unions, supported militantly by the Communist Party, held aloft the banner of struggle. Their leadership of the unorganized into struggle was a decisive factor in winning a measure of relief for the starving jobless, and their militant strikes not only placed a serious hindrance in the way of the wage cutters, but also served as a powerful stimulus to the huge labor battles soon to occur under the New Deal. And when the big strike struggles developed in 1933 to 34, the TUUL was a real factor in furthering the organization and militancy of the workers. The TUUL unions, however, did not succeed in building up powerful organizations numerically. This was largely because of the extremely difficult conditions under which they worked: blacklists, police raids, court injunctions, deportation of leaders, etc. A factor also in many cases was weak organization work. The union's membership was loose and subject to violent fluctuations, hence exact estimates of their numerical strength were difficult to make. Their mass influence, however, extended far and wide beyond the concrete limits of the organizations. In the middle of 1934, the TUUL reached its maximum trade union organization with approximately 125,000 members. This was aside from approximately 150,000 members reported for the National Unemployed Council in 1933 by its secretary, Herbert Benjamin. In the earlier stages of its work, the TUUL developed a number of secretarian weaknesses, which injured its general efficiency. The first was a tendency, under the fierce attacks from its many enemies, to develop its union programs upon a too advanced militant basis and to identify the organizations too closely with the Communist Party. This, of course, had the effect of checking the growth of the organization by making difficult its contacts with the more conservative workers and by narrowing down the TUUL United Front with the progressives. It was a departure from the original plan for the independent unions, which called for programs not so sharply militant, but more of a broad united front character. The second serious weakness of the TUUL in this period was the beginning of a tendency in the direction of dual unionism, the traditional weakness of the American left wing. The basis of this was the deplorable situation in the AFL, its lassitude in the face of the employer's attacks, and its rapid decline in strength and influence. This tended to make the TUUL neglect the work, in the old unions, to concentrate on the new unions and to establish new unions in some cases when it would have been more practical to have worked inside the AFL. During 1929 to 32, the AFL was indeed in a critical position and showed many signs of disintegration. It was reaping in full the bitter crop of misleadership that its reactionary leaders had long been sowing. During the wartime, these leaders had stupidly thrown away an unprecedented opportunity to organize many millions of workers. Then in the great 1919-22 post-war offensive of the bosses, they had, by their policy of craft scabbery and retreat, made labor suffer the biggest defeat in its whole career. They had followed this up during the Coolidge prosperity years, which could have been spent successfully organizing the workers, by adopting the infamous B&O class collaboration schemes which devitalized and paralyzed the whole labor movement. And finally, when the crisis came upon them, craft union leaders walked right into Hoover's wage cut, starve the unemployed murderous policy. The general result was utter stagnation in the AFL unions, whose membership fell from 4,078,740 in 1920 to 2,126,796 in 1933, and the growth of the widespread belief that the AFL was definitely in decline. When the Cleveland TUUL Convention laid down the policy for the independent unions it proposed, first, that the new unions might be affiliated to the AFL under conditions in which militant policy and leadership were assured, and second, that work within the AFL unions should be continued and intensified. But under the pressure of the struggle and in view of the reactionary and broken down conditions of the AFL, with its no-strike policies, its hidebound unions slowly crumbling and its membership dispirited and demoralized, the TUUL tended to deviate from its originally correct line in both of these important essentials of organization policy. It began to stress independent unionism somewhat too much. On the one hand, it abandoned the policy of conditional affiliation of the new unions to the AFL and tended to develop the TUUL as a rival trade union national center, and, on the other hand, it decidedly slackened its work within the AFL unions, although every statement of TUUL general policy stressed the necessity for such activity. With regard to the latter point, the most important work done by the TUUL in the old unions during this period was through the AFL Committee for Unemployment Insurance, which I have previously noted. Besides this, there was little more than rather desultory activities in the railroad, needle, mining, building, printing, metal, and shoecraft unions. The consequence was a great weakening of TUUL influence in the AFL unions. One sign of this was that leadership of the industrial union movement in the AFL, traditionally led by the left wing, passed over automatically to John L. Lewis when he began his agitation for industrial unionism. Another result of TUUL neglect to work within the AFL unions was to give a stimulus to the growth of the Conference for Progressive Labor Action, an organization which, made up chiefly of lower trade union functionaries and intellectual dilettantes and headed by A.J. Must of Brookwood Labor College, tried to occupy the place once held in the craft unions by the old TUEL. But this opportunistic organization failed, and it finally merged into the Trotskyist Workers' Party. We have seen, however, that with the new situation, the TUUL, following its true line of unity, resumed in full its work within the AFL. The life of the TUUL showed that its policy of independent unionism was basically correct and historically justified under the given conditions. This is true in spite of the incorrect tendency, already indicated, to distort in some cases that policy in the direction of dual unionism. The TUUL's program of class struggle, industrial unionism, organization of the unorganized, trade union democracy, unemployment insurance, equal rights for Negroes, fights against fascism and war, etc., were also fundamentally correct and corresponded to the true interests of the working class. The TUUL unions and organizations of unemployed were a real force in the class struggle during the Hoover period, and they took a very militant and effective part in the big strike upheavals of 1933 to 35. The sectarian weaknesses noted above, however, operated to considerably lessen the TUUL's potential influence, both within the trade unions and in the independent union movement. But, as we have seen, the great sharpening of the workers' fight in the strike period, under the Roosevelt New Deal, soon caused a drastic change in the policy of the TUUL, so that once more its main stress was placed upon work within the reformist unions. All factors considered, the TUUL represented a necessary and correct stage in the development of the American labor movement. 1936. That was Chapter 23 of American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good evening.